Farmer Niban had seen a lot in his 70. Odd years he'd seen sheep stuck in. Places sheep had no business being. Cabbages grow to alarming sizes, and once, a cow that could whistle, but nothing not. Even the cow had prepared him for the glowing silver craft that landed with A. Soft wump in his west field the cows had. Scattered the chickens had fainted, and Herbert, his prize BLL, stood stock still, staring at the strange object as though it owed money. Niban, who was halfway through his afternoon cup of tea, placed a mug carefully on the fence post and squinted at the craft. Well, that's new, he muttered, adjusting his cap. The thing was shiny round and hummed softly like a kettle just about to boil before Niban could decide whether to poke it with his stick or run for the hills. A hatch slid open with a hiss, and out stepped a figure so otherworldly that even Herbert let out a low, confused moo. She was tall, with long, shimmering limbs that seemed to catch the sunlight and toss it back in a way that made her look like she was carved from moonlight itself. Her hair, if it could be called hair, flowed like liquid silver, and her eyes were enormous, the kind of eyes you could drown in if you weren't careful. She moved with a grace that made even the best-dressed sheepdog look clumsy, and when she spoke, her voice was like music, soft, lilting, and completely incomprehensible. Blips RN, she said, or something to that effect. Niban blinked. Pardon, the figure tilted her head, then tried again, and Cora, right, said Niban, because it seemed like the polite thing to say. By now a small crowd had gathered at the edge of the field, drawn by the glow and increasingly agitated moving of Herbert. Among them was Mayor Quimbley, who fancied himself a man of action, or at least a man who could look like one in a crisis. He adjusted his waistcoat, cleared his throat, and stepped forward, greeting Sir Visitor. He called, his voice trembling just slightly, on behalf of the good people of Walwick. Welcome to Earth. The figure turned her large, luminous eyes toward him, and for a moment Quimbley looked like he might faint, but then she raised her hands in what could only be described as a universal gesture of peace and said, "Blorp." Well, said Quimbley, looking immensely pleased with himself, "I think we're off to a good start." The villagers nodded and murmured in agreement, though none of them had the faintest idea what was going on. Things might have ended their polite nods, a few cups of tea, and everyone agreeing not to mention the incident again, if not for old Bert. Bert was the sort of man who could take any situation and turn it into a source of profound discomfort for everyone involved. He had a knack for asking questions no one wanted to answer and making observations no one wanted to hear. As the crowd marveled at the strange visitor, Bert leaned toward his neighbor and muttered, "You think she knows about the important bit?" "What important bit?" The neighbor is back. Bert gave him a significant look. "Reproduction, mate, can't have a proper first contact without explaining that. Can we?" The neighbor, who had no interest in discussing reproduction with anyone, let alone an alien, looked horrified, but Bert's mutterings had already reached the ears of Quimbley, who turned pale and then inexplicably resolute. "Yes," he said, as though addressing an invisible audience. "Yes, that is important. She should understand what," said several people at once. "Reproduction," Quimbley declared, puffing out his chest, "it's the cornerstone of life, isn't it? We have a duty to share our knowledge." Niban, who had been hoping this would all blow over so he could get back to his tea, groaned. "You can't be serious, Quimbley." But it was too late. The mayor had taken upon himself to educate the visitor, and the crowd, sensing this would be at least mildly entertaining, began to murmur in approval. Someone fetched Dr. Miles. Quimbley ordered. "He'll know what to do." Dr. Emily, who had spent the past 20 years tending to Wibblewick's various aches, pains, and mysterious rashes, was not thrilled to be summoned. Still, he arrived with his trusty black bag and a look of grim determination, ready to tackle whatever nonsense the villagers had cooked up. This time, when Quimbley explained the situation, Miles' eyebrows disappeared Into his hairline. You want me to what? Explain reproduction, Quimbley said. Firmly to an alien yes, and how, pray tell? Do you expect me to do that? Use diagrams? Quimbley suggested, and so against his better judgment Dr. MLE found himself standing in the village barn facing the alien who had since been dubbed LM4, convenience with a large sketch pad, and a crowd of eager onlookers. Right, MLE began flipping to a page that vaguely resume a human anatomy diagram. This is a human. LM tilted her head, her luminous eyes narrowing slightly, and this MLE continued, pointing to a particularly questionable part of the drawing. Is the reproductive organ? The barn fell silent. What does it do? LM asked, her voice as calm as ever. Well, MLE hesitated. It's for reproduction. And what is that? It's how we make more humans. LM's eyes. Why didn't you grow them? Sort of. And this organ, it is required. Yes, there was a long pause during which LM appeared to be processing this information, then with a kind of unflinching logic that only an outsider could muster, she said, show me. MLE blinked. I beg your pardon, you said. It is important. LM set her tone as serene as a summer breeze. I wish to understand. Show me how it works. The crowd erupted into a mixture of gasps, laughter, and horrified whispers. Not like. Yet MLE spluttered, his face turning a shade of red previously unseen in WCK. Good heavens, no. Quimbley, sensing things were spiraling out of control, stepped in. Perhaps an demonstration within object might suffice, and that was how Sheriff Podge ended up sitting across from LM, holding a turnip. It's symbolic. Podge explained, though it was clear he had no idea what he was talking about. Lamb regarded the turnip with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. It is shaped like this. Not exactly, PG admitted then. Why use it? Because PG said, now visibly sweating. It's close enough. The barn erupted into chaos once again. Suggestions were shouted, arguments broke out, and someone tried to explain the concept of metaphors, which only made things worse. Through it all, LM sat patiently holding the turnip and looking increasingly bewildered. Finally, Niban, who had quite enough of this nonsense, stood up. Right, that's it. This is ridiculous. Just tell her it's complicated and leave it at that. The crowd grumbled but began to disperse, leaving LM alone with her turnip and the weight of humanity's collective awkwardness. Later that evening, LM sat on the hill overlooking the village, the turnip resting beside her. Sheriff Podge joined her, carrying 2 cups of tea. Sorry about all that, he said, handing her a cup. Lamb sipped cautiously. Your species is unusual. Yeah, PG agreed. We're a bit of a mess. LM smiled faintly. Perhaps, but you are also endearing. Podge chuckled. That's one way to put it. The days following the great turnip incident, as it came to be known, were oddly quiet. In Woik, LM had settled into a sort of routine, one that involved frequent strolls through the village, long conversations with Sheriff Podge, and the occasional bewildered observation of human behavior. It was clear to everyone that Lim was not just passing through. Her craft remained firmly parked in Niban Westfield, its glowing surface reflecting the sunset each evening. The villagers, having mostly recovered from their initial excitement, began to treat her presence with a mix of curiosity and cautious acceptance. She's not so bad, really, old bird admitted one morning over his second pine at the pub. Bit odd. But who isn't odd? She's an alien, exclaimed Millie the Barrett as she wiped down the counter. I'd say odd is putting it lightly. Well, she doesn't complain about the ale, does she? Bert countered. Probably because she doesn't drink it. Millie shot back. Bert shrugged. All the same, I reckon she's no trouble, not like them tourists from the city. Meanwhile, LM continued her observations, jotting down notes in a peculiar shimmering notebook that seemed to write itself as she moved her fingers over it. She was fast, aided by human life, particularly their rituals. The concept of sharing tea, for example, baffled her. It wasn't just a liquid, it was the way people gathered, the way they used it as An excuse to talk to Bond to argue about. Things like the correct steeping time. Sheriff Podge, who had taken a pawn. Himself to act as LM's unofficial guide. Often found himself struggling to explain the nuances of human behavior. Why do you do this, LM asked one. Afternoon, gesturing to the group of women hanging freshly washed linens on a line in the village square laundry. Podge replied, well, because we need clean clothes. LM tilted her head. But why do you do it together? It's just how it's done, Podge said, scratching his head. Makes it go faster, I suppose, and people like to talk while they work. Talking is efficient. Then Podge chuckled. Not always. Sometimes it's just nice. Lem nodded, though her expression suggested she was filing the information away for later analysis. As the weeks went on, LM's presence began to feel almost normal, at least by Weibelwick standards. She helped Farmer Nib in men defense, much to Herbert the Bull's annoyance. She spent hours at the schoolhouse watching the children learn their letters and numbers, and once to everyone's astonishment, she joined a village choir, her voice blending so beautifully with the others that even the notoriously grumpy organist was moved to tears. But despite her growing integration into village life, LM couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she wasn't truly understood. The turnip incident had been her first clue that humans were as bewildered by her as she was by them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the air filled with the scent of hay and with smoke, LM sat with Podge on the same hill overlooking the village. I've been thinking, she said, her voice soft. Dangerous business, that. Podge replied with a grin. Lamb ignored the joke. Your species places great importance on understanding, and yet when faced with the unknown, you often respond with confusion or fear. Podge nodded. That's fair. We're not great with new things. Takes us a while to get our heads around them. Do you fear me? Podge looked at her, surprised. No, I don't think anyone here does, and yet you do not understand me. Well, no, PG admitted, but I reckon that's all right. We don't have to understand everything straight away. Sometimes it's enough just to get along. LM considered this, her luminous eyes reflecting the fading light. Perhaps, but wish to learn more about your kind. Truly learn? Podge smiled. Then you're already one of us. Lem wanted to understand. Well, that's about as human as it gets. LM returned his smile, though there was a wistfulness in her expression that Podge couldn't quite place. Unbeknownst to either of them, events were brewing in the wider world. Word of the Silvercraft in WCK had begun to spread, reaching the ears of people far less inclined toward acceptance than the villagers. One such person was Edwin J. Fluffin III, the self-proclaimed alien expert who hosted a late-night radio show called Cosmic Conspiracies from his studio in London. He spun tales of government cover-ups, alien abductions, and the secret lizard overlords controlling the weather. When a caller mentioned of strange being living in a tiny village in the countryside, Fluff's eyes lit up with a kind of manic excitement usually reserved for a 20 LB note in an old coat pocket. We must investigate, he declared, pounding his desk. For emphasis, for the truth shall not hide from. Flew on. Within days, a convoy of vans plastered with garish slogans. Aliens are among us and the truth is out there. But mostly here arrived in WT, bringing with them cameras, microphones, and an alarming number of tinfoil hats. The villagers who had just begun to enjoy the quiet rhythm of life with LM were none too pleased. What do they want? Millie demanded, watching the newcomer set up camp in the village square. Publicity, muttered Niban, who had taken to carrying a pitchfork everywhere, just in case. Lamb, for her part, seemed more curious than concerned. Are these normal humans? She asked. Podge, not exactly. Podge admitted to the sword, who see a shadow and think it's a monster. Best to steer clear, but steering clear proved impossible when Fluffing himself marched up to LM, brandishing a microphone like a weapon. Madam Alien, he began, his voice dripping with melodrama. What do you say to the Accusations that you are here to conquer. Earth LM blinked, I am here to study. Laundry Fluffin looked momentarily. Thrown but quickly recovered A. Cunning ruse, but we know the truth you. Seek to infiltrate our society. And that's enough, Podge interrupted, stepping between LM and the self-proclaimed expert she's done. Nothing wrong, leave her be, but Fluffin was not so easily deterred to people. Have a right to know they have a right. To be left alone, Podge shot back. The standoff might have escalated further if not for Herbert the Bull, who chose that moment to make his displeasure known by charging through the square, scattering reporters and knocking over camera as chaos erupted. LM turned to Podger. Serene demeanor, unshaken your species is. Resilient. Podge laughed despite himself. That's one way to put it, and as the sun set over WCK, the villagers rallied together to protect their newfound friend, proving that while humanity might be messy, awkward, and prone to misunderstanding, it was also fiercely loyal to those it called its own. The chaos Fluffin and his entourage brought to WCK didn't vanish overnight, though. The villagers tried their best to hasten the process. The sight of Farmer Niban shaking a pitchfork at anyone who dared trespass on his fields became a common occurrence. Millie started handing out tea in cups that were suspiciously chipped, possibly to encourage the visitors to leave faster. Sheriff Podge, however, bore the brunt of the intrusion. His days became a tangled mess of diffusing arguments, escorting overly curious reporters out of private gardens, and occasionally standing between LM and Fluffin, whose theories only grew wilder by the day. Do you feel remorse for invading our planet? Flew on, demanded one morning, shoving his microphone under LM's nose. I did not invade, LM replied evenly. Your gravity intercepted my trajectory. I was merely passing by. Fluff's eyes gleamed as if she confirmed his suspicions. So you admit to being here against your will, a prisoner of Earth's gravity, I suppose that is accurate, LM said thoughtfully, though her tone lacked the drama Fluffin clearly craved, and yet Fluffin continued, turning to his cameraman. She remains here, watching, observing, preparing. She's helping Mrs. Trindle fix her barn roof. Podge interrupted dryly, appearing behind Fluffin with a firm grip on his shoulder. Now, how about you observe the village boundary instead? Fluffin scowled, but allowed himself to be guided away, muttering something about small minds failing to grasp cosmic significance. LM, meanwhile, continued her peculiar integration into village life. The barn repair turned into a full-fledged construction project as she introduced Mrs. Trindle to alien adhesives that rendered nails entirely obsolete. The school children adored her, especially after she built a floating globe that turned geography lessons into something resembling a magic show. Yet despite these moments of connection, LM often found herself puzzling over the intricacies of human behavior. For instance, the sheer variety of greetings baffled her. In her own culture, a simple exchange of light orbs sufficed for all occasions, but humans waved, nodded, shook hands, hugged, and sometimes engaged in an awkward maneuver Podge called the cheek kiss. LM tried to document these variations, but every time she thought she understood the rules, a new exception presented itself. Then there was the matter of food. LM could consume human sustenance without difficulty, but the emotional weight humans attached to meals intrigued her. A simple pie could be comforting, a sandwich unsatisfactory, and tea disastrous if the milk to water ratio wasn't precisely right. One evening, as Podge joined her for a meal outside her ship, she brought up her observations. Why does food matter so much to your kind? She asked, holding up a slice of bread as though it might reveal its secrets. Podge chewed thoughtfully before answering. It's not just about eating. Food brings people together. It's how we show we care or celebrate or sometimes argue. Ever seen two villagers debate the best way to bake a scone? Lamb considered this. So food is a social lubricant. Pod snorted. Never heard it like that, but yeah, I guess so. The conversation was interrupted by a Commotion from the village square shouts echoed through the evening air, and Podge instinctively reached for his hat. What? Now, he muttered, rising to his feet. LM followed, curious as ever. They found a crowd gathered near the pub where Fluffin stood on a makeshift stage, constructed from overturned crates. Ladies and gentlemen, he bellowed, I present to you irrefutable evidence of extraterrestrial intent. He held aloft a peculiar device that gleamed under the lantern light. That's my egg, whisked Millie. Deadpan from the crowd, Fluffer and faltered but quickly recovered. Aha, an alien egg whisk clearly stolen to conceal its true purpose. Millie folded her arms. You nicked that from my kitchen this morning, you daft plonker. The crowd murmured in agreement, and Fluffer Ant's smug expression wavered. Is this true? Podge demanded, stepping forward. Its research flew on, protested for the good of humanity. Research or not, Podge said. You don't steal from a village. Of the crowd nodded, and Fluffin looked increasingly cornered. Lamb, observing from the edge, decided it was time to intervene. She stepped forward, her serene presence silencing the crowd. This object, she said, gesture to the whisk, is indeed a tool of great importance. It ensures a uniform dispersion of matter within a vessel, a principle valued by both my kind and yours. Fluffer and Beam taking this as vindication, but LM wasn't finished. However, she continued, its purpose here is clear: to create nourishment, to foster community. That it was taken without permission disrupts that purpose. A grave misuse by any standard. The crowd erupted into laughter, and Fluff's face turned a shade that rivaled Mrs. Trendle's prize tomatoes. Podge stepped in, confiscating the whisk and ushering Fluffing off the stage. As the villagers dispersed, LM turned to Podge. Did I handle that correctly? Perfectly, Podge said with a grin. But even as the village returned to its usual rhythm, the encounter left LM pondering humanity's contradictions. They were capable of pettiness and kindness, chaos and order, suspicion and trust, and though she still had much to learn, one thing became increasingly clear: she wasn't just studying humanity, she was becoming part of it. The weeks turned into months, and life in WCK settled into a peculiar harmony. LM, once a curious and visitor, had become a fixture of village life. Her presence was no longer met with wide-eyed stares, but warm smiles and the occasional wave. Fluffington and his entourage, despite their initial disruptions, had left their grand expose never materialized, thanks in large part to Lim's calm demeanor and the villager steadfast refusal to be part of a cosmic conspiracy. Podge, ever pragmatic, had escorted the journalist to the train station with a final warning: don't let me catch you trying to steal another wisp. But for LM, the most profound changes were not in the village, but within herself. The human concepts of community, trust, and care had reshaped her understanding of connection. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of gold and purple, LM stood at the edge of her ship. Podge approached, his hat in hand, an unusual look of uncertainty on his face. Leaving, he asked, though the answer was clear. LM nodded. My people have received my signals. They wish to know what I have learned. And what will you tell them? He asked, his tone softer than usual. LM consider her words carefully. I will tell them that humanity is a contradiction, that you are both flawed and extraordinary, and that your greatest strength lies not in your technology or power, but in your ability to create bonds, to care for one another, even in your imperfections. Podge chuckled, his gaze fixed on the ground. That's a kinder assessment that we probably deserve, perhaps, LM said, tilting her head. But it is true. A silence fell between them, comfortable yet heavy with the knowledge of parting. LM broke it. First, you have been my greatest teacher, she said. Your patience and wisdom have shown me more than I could have learned alone. Podge shifted, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. Well, someone had to keep you out of trouble. She smiled, and you did. Most of the time. A distant hum filled the air as Lim's ship began to awaken. The villagers gathered in the Square watching with a mix of awe and melancholy. Mrs. Trindle wiped a tear from her cheek while Millie handed out tea and mugs that were suspiciously intact. This time, as the ship's lights grew, brighter limbs stepped forward to address the crowd. "You have given me more than I can express," she said, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "I hope in my way I have given something back." Millie piped up. "You've definitely given us a new barn roof that'll outlive us all." The crowd laughed, the sound warm and genuine. Pod stepped closer to Elm's hand. Outstretched, she hesitated for a moment, then took it, understanding the gesture. "Now take care of yourself," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. "And you," she replied with a final glance at the village. Lm ascended into her ship. The hum grew louder, the vessel lifting gracefully into the sky. The villagers watched until it became a mere speck, then vanished entirely. For a moment, silence reigned in wake. Then Millie clapped her hands together. "Well, that was a spectacle," she said. "Now who's going to help me with the washing UPS life in?" The village resumed, though it was undeniably changed. Lm's time among them became a story one told around fires and in pubs, passed down to new generations. And though the villagers would never see her again, they felt her presence in every act of kindness, every moment of connection. As for Lm, she carried WCK with her, a piece of humanity etched into her very being. Her report to her people spoke not just of humans, but of their capacity for growth, for understanding, and for something far greater than she had ever anticipated. Belonging in the... And it wasn't just Lm who had learned from the humans, it was the humans who had grown too simply by knowing her.